What is fiscal policy? There were two basic facts uncovered in our previous episodes leading to today's lecture. 1. In modern states, the function of controlling money supply on one side is delegated to the country's central bank, and the range of powers and tools of control over goods and services produced is in the hands of the executive government, such as cabinet of ministers. In formal terms, the central bank is responsible for the monetary policy, while the government is overlooking fiscal policy. 2. The country's president and/or prime minister, with their cabinet of ministers, serve as the executive branch of government, meaning they are the managers overlooking practical implementation of the existing laws and running all of the country's current affairs. They are usually appointed by the political party, or a coalition of such, that won the most recent election. This branch is often called the government, in a more narrow sense of the term, and we will use it rather in this sense further below. Now, at the core of fiscal policy lies the country's budget, which is the annual statement of the government's outlays and revenues. Essentially, the budget has two purposes. 1. To finance the activities of the government. 2. To achieve macroeconomic objectives. Normally, the Cabinet of Ministers and the Ministry of Finance in particular prepare the detailed budget and present it for the approval vote in the Parliament. They could also ask the Parliament to implement some new laws, which would make practical implementation of that government's plan possible. Fiscal policy is the use of the country's budget to achieve macroeconomic objectives, such as full employment, sustained economic growth, and price level stability. And the key word here is sustained. As much as positive the term economic growth sounds in general, it's not exactly the case of the more the merrier. When economic growth reaches certain levels, the economy becomes what we call overheated. At those rates, the economic growth is unsustainable as it produces many imbalances, such as the levels of inflation, for example, that might go totally out of control if contractionary fiscal policy isn't applied by the government. And perhaps there is even less explanation needed as to why the budget is used to implement expansionary fiscal policy at the time of economic decline in the country. The budget consists of two major parts, which reflect government's revenues on one side and the outlays on the other. When planned revenues are equal to the planned outlays, we call it a balanced budget. When the outlays are greater than the revenues, it is called budget deficit. And when the revenues exceed the outlays, we've got a budget surplus. Budget revenues come from personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, indirect taxes, and investment income. Personal income taxes are the largest revenue source. Outlays are transfer payments, expenditure on goods and services, and debt interest. Transfer payments, such as welfare, social security, and subsidies, are the largest item of outlays. Fiscal policy has important effects on employment, potential GDP, and aggregate supply, called supply-side effects. Generally speaking, an increase in income tax decreases workers' income and therefore reduces the number of labor employed, which in turn decreases the potential GDP and decreases aggregate supply. Similarly, taxes on consumption expenditure, such as sales tax or VAT, reduce purchasing ability of wages earned, which further undermines the value of the labor. So, if, let's say, the income tax was 35% and the sales tax was 10%, a $100 worth of labor could buy the worker only $55 worth of goods as a result. Finally, a tax on capital income lowers the quantity of saving and investment and slows the growth rate of real GDP. The graph demonstrating the relation of government's revenues to taxation rates is known as Laffer curve. A government's increase in taxes can be increasing its revenue only till a point at which revenues start rapidly decreasing due to shrinking GDP, which is suffering from overtaxation. There are two things in the government budget that change automatically in response to the state of the economy: tax revenues and the outlays. The decrease in GDP not only decreases people's incomes, and therefore the taxes collected from such, it also at the same time increases government's outlays as more social assistance is needed to the growing number of unemployed. The budget deficit is increasing under such a scenario. Opposite to that, an increase in GDP leads to increases in people's incomes, the taxes paid, and decrease in government's outlays. It would normally result in a budget surplus. A fiscal stimulus is the use of fiscal policy to increase production and employment. Fiscal stimulus can be either automatic or discretionary. Automatic fiscal policy is a fiscal policy action triggered by the state of the economy with no government action. Discretionary fiscal policy is a policy action that is initiated by an act of Parliament. Changes in government expenditure and taxes change aggregate demand and have multiplier effects. Because government expenditure is a component of aggregate expenditure, an increase in government expenditure increases real GDP. When real GDP increases, incomes rise and consumption expenditure increases. Aggregate demand increases, but an increase in government expenditure increases government borrowing and raises the real interest rate. With the higher cost of borrowing, investment decreases, which partly offsets the increase in government expenditure. The tax multiplier is the quantity effect of a change in taxes on aggregate demand. The demand side effects of a tax cut are likely to be smaller than an equivalent increase in government expenditure. As previously explained, taxes drive a wedge between the cost of labor and take-home pay, as well as between the cost of borrowing and the return on lending. Taxes decrease employment, saving, investment, real GDP, as well as its growth rate. A tax cut reduces these negative effects, increases real GDP and its growth rate. The supply side effects of a tax cut probably dominate the demand side effects and make the overall tax multiplier larger than the government expenditure multiplier. The use of discretionary fiscal policy is seriously hampered by three time lags: recognition lag, lawmaking lag, impact lag. Generally speaking, in modern-day politics, this could be the most distinctive characteristic on how left-leaning parties differ from the right-leaning ones in economic terms. The left favors working with the demand-side fiscal policy through government expenditure, while the right sees greater benefits in fiscal policy that promotes more the supply side via tax cuts. This is not meant to oversimplify things, as obviously the differences and approaches of both are much greater and more complex. But in the context of today's topic, I thought it would be well worth mentioning. We will wrap up here today while looking forward to our next episode, in which I think we should expand more on the topic of taxes. Till then, thank you for watching and stay smart. Like and subscribe. Make sure to hit that bell icon to get notified when we post.